Welcome, dear students, to the massive open online course on Political Economy 2. In today's module, we are going to discuss about the idea of a third world. In this module, we are basically going to learn about the concept of the third world, and we would like to explain or examine that concept in detail. And we would also try to gain a preliminary insight into some of the problems that are experienced by such countries by examining the validity of using a single category for such an amorphous group. And thirdly, we would also comment on how it gave rise to a new international order. Now, the original meaning of the term third world referred to a group of countries outside the great power blocks. There has been a lot of discussion as to who used the term first, but it is generally accepted that it was a French demographer and economic historian, Alfred Sauvy, who coined the term in the early 1950s. However, there is also a view that it should have been translated as third force and not as third world, because Sauvy seemed to have in mind the problem of power blocks during the Cold War and of a third force which is distinct from the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. Non-alignment in the military and the diplomatic spheres is one of the earliest qualities that are associated with the third world status. The third world was seen as a group of countries trying to demonstrate that they were neither pro-USA or pro-USSR, but rather wanted to stand above the ideological conflicts threatening their very existence. This stance was most strikingly represented by the Bandung Conference attended by the representatives of 29 African and Asian countries in 1955. The word third world also conveys the concept of solidarity. It conveys a common interest and solidarity amongst the developing countries based on their primary producing economic status, their relative poverty, their dependence on agriculture, and their distinctive forms of economic regime, which is neither modeled on the Eastern Bloc of planned economies like Russia, USSR, and so on, nor the Western free market system. The third world was seen to fall outside the first world of the advanced capitalistic democracies and the second world of industrially advanced communist countries. Now, if we talk about China, like China's Mao Zedong, he produced a very different categorization of the countries in which the USA and the USSR constituted the first world, while Japan and the European countries and Canada, they constituted the second world, while we had Africa, Latin America, and most of the Asia, they formed the third world. Now, if we look at this categorization, then we can see that many of the countries in the OPEC world, that is the oil and petroleum and export countries of the world, they would they do have huge wealth, but they would fall into the third category, that is in the third world countries. The claim that the Chinese premier made here was that both USA and the USSR were imperialistic in nature, with their developed satellites as the second world and the primary producing former colonial possessions of the first and the second world basically formed the third world nations. So that is why we find that in spite of the fact that OPEC countries are rich countries, they basically came under the category of the third world nations. Next, we come across a very important concept, anti-imperialism. Now, there has been an idea of an alliance against colonialism, neocolonialism, and racialism. So, the third world stood for solidarity against the continuing intervention and involvement of the powerful economies in the developing economies and the polities of the world in an attempt to strengthen economic sovereignty at a time when it was not very obvious that political and economic autonomy did not necessarily go together, and that the achievement of constitutional independence did not guarantee freedom internally from external constraints. So, the idea of the third world thus tries to capture a common experience of exploitation by the richer and the more powerful societies. So basically, if we look at all the third world countries of the world, we will find that they have experienced such exploitation to certain degrees, and it was strongly felt by many third world countries of the world that it was persisting even after independence. So, there's a common saying in most of these economies, which they usually call the colonial hangover. So, this colonial hangover continued, persisted even after independence of these economies from their colonial counterparts. After explaining the concept of solidarity and anti-imperialism, I come into regionalism. Now, in most of the third world economies, we will find that they're mainly associated with the idea of regional coherence through pan-nationalistic movements. Now, what do I mean by this? The third world might not represent a grouping of countries all with identical interest. But within the third world bloc or group, as we say, there could be groups of states that shares common interests cutting across national boundaries. For example, the pan-Arab world or the pan-African world. Such concepts were important to the political leaders in the developing countries in the 1960s. So basically what we're trying to talk here is about some type of regional third world blocks that were formed, which kept in mind common characteristics of those economies, and so that helped them to gel together in terms of identical interest or shared interest. And of course here, national boundaries did not really become very important. Now, when I talk about national boundaries, how was this national boundaries created? These national boundaries were seen as the creation of European colonialism, especially in Africa. They were to some extent alien, reflecting a colonial past, and institutions were set up to reflect this internationalism, and some still exist, though without the significance that they were originally intended to have. So basically, in very short and simple words, I can say that national boundaries was again the creation or the product or the fallout of the European colonialism. And this again becomes extremely important in terms of in the African nations. The third world, basically, I can say that now will be defined by a group of countries which, by now I hope it's clear that they are supposed to have some sort of colonial history. But even in spite of having colonial history, they are in the process of developing economically and socially from a status which is characterized by low incomes, which are characterized by a very much huge dependence on the agricultural sector. There is weakness in trading relations. There is social deprivation for a large section of the society. And of course, you can see instances of restrictions on political and civil liberties. These are certain characteristics which characterizes the third world nations in most of the cases. So very rarely will you come a nation which is clubbed as a third world country and do not possess such characteristics. If we go further deeper into the analysis of how exactly a third world nation should resemble or what are their status, the status and trends will follow the components of the definition. As I have already said that poverty is a very important feature, so we can say that the type of income levels that the people in the third world nations have are generally average or low income levels. The achievement of political independence because they were basically under the colonial rulers. Industrialization, because I've already said that these economies are primarily agricultural in character, so industrialization is not much developed in these type of economies. And of course, as I said, one thing regarding the trading relations, so which essentially indicates that their integration into the world economy is not that much pronounced, and also they do have a lower sense of social well-being and human development. So these also becomes very, very important components when I try to analyze the third world nations. Next, I come to the idea of political independence. Now, only a tiny minority of countries that would be regarded as a part of the third world by other criteria have not experienced colonialism at some stage in their recent histories. You will not be able, very few countries you are going to get which have not experienced colonialism in their past. So, the picture of the third world in this respect has become more complex with the dissolution of the erstwhile Soviet Union and the emergence of a number of independent states that are formerly part of it. Most of these states like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan rank as lower middle income countries, along with economies in Africa like Senegal, in Asia like Thailand, and in South America, Latin America such as Peru. However, there is less significant variation in the third world status than the length of time that countries have been independent from their colonizers, with most Latin American countries gaining political independence in the early 19th century, and most African countries got independence from their colonial rulers only after the Second World War. Now, if I go on talking about political independence, the experience of imperial political control and economic penetration varied considerably, okay, as did also the routes that these economies took to gain their independence. So there were armed struggle in some of the economies, there were constitutional negotiations in some of the economies, so that also varied between economies. However, the legacy of imperialism and colonialism was everywhere profound, transforming political institutions and processes. So the new geopolitical boundaries were drawn, reactions against the alien rule mobilized new political forces and alliances, indigenous social structures were altered by European economic interventions and settlement. Valuable indigenous resources such as precious metals and labor were extracted by force. Agriculture production was transformed by plantations and the control of smallholder production to produce cash crops which were demanded by the European commerce. The colonial agriculture that we talk about was gradually incorporated into the world trade. Food crops were transferred from one region to another region of the world, and agricultural changes, basically in these type of agricultural changes that we talk about, had permanent ecological consequences. Handicraft production declined and it was replaced by cultivation and extraction of primary products for exports rather than by industrial manufacturing capacity. And European investment in the economic infrastructure of colonies facilitated this trading regime and strengthened links with the imperial economy. The next point that comes to our mind, as we said that most of these economies are poverty stricken, that is in terms of their average income. Most third world economies are poor by international standards. The majority are found in the low income or low middle income categories, which are used by World Bank and defined in terms of their GNP per capita. Differences in per capita also varies greatly between the regions of the world. And we find that many regions of the third world continues to lag behind the developed economies. The gap in real incomes between such third world countries, such as those in East Asia and the industrialized countries, has narrowed considerably since 1945. But the gap between the developed countries and the other regions of the third world have widened, so that many third world countries have per capita income, real income, that are well below USA even in the early 19th century. Now, if we talk about recent data, what do we find? That an estimated around 3 billion people, around half of all the inhabitants in the developing world, remain poor and lives in less than US $2 per person per day, measured at the purchasing power parity. Underpinning this divide is a more than five-fold gap in labor productivity levels, measured at purchasing power parity. Average output per worker in the developed world stood at nearly 73,000 US dollars in 2011, compared with an average of only 13,600 US dollars in the developing economies. So you can understand the divergence that these two worlds share. Now, to answer this question, industrialization, we know that low per capita income are related to an economy's high level of dependence on agriculture. Income can tend to rise as countries industrialize and the size of the manufacturing sector increases. Countries in the third world, they tend to be more dependent on agriculture than on the manufacturing sectors of the industry. Like if we take examples in Africa and South Asia, as the number of people for whom agriculture is their main source of occupation or income, they actually increased in the 1980s by more than 25% in these regions of the world, the number of people who are practicing agriculture. However, the most notable exception to this type of a picture, of the general picture, are the Asian tigers, the East Asian economies of Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea and Singapore, which at the end of 1980s were basically exporting much more greater value of manufactured goods than the rest of the third world put together. And other newly industrializing countries, which in economics we call NICs, in Asia and Latin America. Now, during the 1980s, the fastest growth in manufacturing occurred in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. Africa's record has generally been poor. There is nothing more to speak about it. But Latin America, the problem with Latin America was that it was held back by their indebtedness, which reduced investment for industrial development in Latin American economies. There was negative growth in the manufacturing production in Bolivia and Argentina, for example. So it is significant for the third world development that its smallest share in world manufacturing is in machinery, which is considered to be the most valuable sector. Third world countries make their most significant contribution, about 1/5, to only 3 sectors, that is food, beverages and tobacco clubbed together, textiles, clothing and footwear, chemical, petroleum and related products. So much of this is accounted for by the movement of multinational corporations to areas of low labor cost, because they have a cheap labor, so MNCs usually tend to locate in these economies. The next point that I have in mind to speak to you is integration with the world economy. So, a third world economy is typically characterized by a high level of dependence on the export of a very small number of commodities. Compared with the diversified exports of most developed countries, the value of third world trade is still concentrated only on few primary commodities whose prices are liable to severe fluctuations. The third world's export markets are predominantly in the developed nations. Only a small proportion of trade is conducted between countries in the third world, and the majority of the world trade takes place between the developed countries. The problem for many third world countries even today is that they are on the periphery of world trade. So, the full integration of the third world economy with the global economy is still a long way off. We can say that. Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic continued to dominate in 2021, external debt stocks of the developing world reached around US 1.1 trillion US dollars, their highest level on record, more than twice their value of 4.1 trillion US dollars registered in 2009 and nearly 5 times that of US 2.1 trillion dollars in 2000. Given the sluggish growth since the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, this translated into a renewed increase in the average ratio of external debt to GDP in most of the third world countries. Now, what do I mean by social well-being? Now, trends reflect overall economic performance. Progress was made between 1965 and 1985, with per capita consumption increasing by nearly 70% in real terms, average life expectancy rising from around 51 to 62 years, and primary school enrollment reaching around 84%. With all other improvements in other characteristics like child mortality rates and so on. Now, to achieve significant improvement in education and health, what is required in the third world countries is higher level of expenditures in the social sector. So, inequality in social well-being as indicated by health and education are also found between the urban and the rural areas and between men and women. If you look at the chart that I have shown here, which I have got from the Human Development Report, you will look at this fact that in the context of life expectancy at birth, we find that there is declining inequality. But if we look at life expectancy at the age of 70, we find increasing inequality amongst the low, medium, high and the very high economies. Again, if we look at the share of population with primary education between 2007 and 2017, we find again in very high economies, very high income economies or development group, we find that the share of population with primary education has gone down, while the share of population with the tertiary education has increased. So this shows the inequality in terms of social development. So now when we try to define the concept of the third world, we are reminded of Gunnar Myrdal, who was a winner of Nobel Prize for Economics in 1974. He once said that the relationship between the rich and the poor countries has been a diplomacy by language, meaning that in the developed and to a lesser extent the underdeveloped countries, there has been a constant search for an acceptable label for the later group. So we sometimes refer to the South rather than using the words developing countries. We also prefer to say less developed countries or the LDCs, while other prefers to use the word underdeveloped, quote unquote. A concept that has taken on a very, very specific meaning and which, as we shall see later, denote a particular kind of interrelationship between countries and a particular process of change. So no one has come with a label that claims universal acceptance. Search is still on and there are various ideological questions that come with it. So since the early 1970s, this third worldism has reflected a campaign for a new international economic order under which the developing countries would secure greater national control of their natural resources, and they would try to protect their economies by collectively agreeing to the prices of raw materials upon which so many of their economies are dependent. So here we find now a more clamor for a new international order where all the third world countries are clubbed together. So third worldism has been to some extent driven by a sense of grievance. Keep in mind grievance against the developed world who appear to have rigged the rules of the international economy against the LDC. So some think it is still important to keep the term third world in order to preserve and convey the values that I've been talking about associated with it. So we can conclude by saying that it would be dangerous to stop talking about the third world and further fragment that group of countries, that their solidarity may somehow be preserved simply because an individual state they are bound to be weak in the relationships with the developed world. The third world is seen, say by one of our Indian scholar, as a sound concept and a flexible, resilient category. Attempts to question its validity is mischievous and misleading. So even if third worldism only means building regional alliances to present a united front economically, that in itself is important, very, very important. It has also been pointed out that to reject the concept because it treats the third world as an undifferentiated mass ignores the psychological and the political connotation of third worldism in favor of an interpretation that denotes an association of countries which are dedicated to the moral blackmail of a guilt-afflicted West. So at the end, we can say that the concept of the third world is basically a type of a shield for these economies against the unruly games that the Western world tries to play with them. Thank you.